Hello, this is Dr. Jim Swaffield. In this video, I'm going to explain a concept called the diffusion of innovations model and discuss why it's important for marketers to understand this model. In previous lessons, I talked about the concept of market segmentation and how to develop a target market profile. I also explained that the marketplace consists of many different segments. For example, one way to segment the market is based on how much product different market segments buy. There are low, medium, and high volume buyers. I also mentioned that companies generally want to target the high volume buyers. Another way to segment the market is based on how quickly consumers will adopt or buy new products when they are introduced to market. And this is what the diffusion of innovations model is all about. The diffusion of innovations model helps us understand which groups of consumers or market segments are the most likely to be the first to rush out to the store to buy a new product, and who is most likely to be the last. I'm going to start by explaining a little bit of history behind the development of the diffusion of innovations model. In 1962, there was a sociologist by the name of Dr. Everett Rogers. Dr. Rogers was a professor at the University of New Mexico and was interested in how information and new ideas spread or diffused through a community. He wanted to understand the demographic and psychographic characteristics of those who were most likely to communicate information which, in essence, educated other people. Well, back in the 1960s, Dr. Rogers was working down in South America. At that time, many people who lived in villages were suffering from a bacterial or parasitic infection known as dysentery. People would get this infection by drinking water straight from lakes and streams. Dr. Rogers explained to the villagers that to prevent getting dysentery, all they had to do was boil the water before they drank it. He explained that tiny microorganisms called bacteria lived in the water, and when people drank the water, they would ingest these bacteria, and this is what was making them sick. Well, as the story goes, not all the villagers accepted his story about bacteria causing dysentery. Some laughed it off and said, how could something so small hurt a human being that was so much bigger? What Dr. Rogers observed was that the village could be segmented into 5 different categories based on their receptivity to the idea that they should boil water before drinking. He noticed that a small percentage of the villagers, roughly 2.5%, would say, I don't know if boiling water will make any difference, but I'll give it a try. This group of people he called the innovators. The innovators were more social in nature and would start talking with others about how effective boiling water had been for them at preventing sickness. A few weeks later, another group of villagers became more receptive to the idea of boiling their water. This group watched the innovators and noticed that they were not getting sick when they drank only boiled water. So they began to boil their water too. Rogers called this group the early adopters and estimated that this segment amounted to about 13.5% of all the villagers. Knowledge of the effectiveness of boiling water was now spreading, or, as Rogers would say, was diffusing through the community. Rogers called this group the early majority and estimated they amounted to approximately 34% of the adult population. Rogers identified two more market segments, the late majority and the laggards. These groups were the last to become informed and adopt this new innovation. They are usually the most traditional and risk-averse groups. Now, each of these 5 groups constitute a different market segment with different demographic, psychographic, behavioral, and geographic characteristics. Because they are separate segments, you can develop a distinct target market profile for each of these 5 segments. Let's have a look at how the diffusion of innovations model is applied in a marketing context. Notice on this diagram, I have changed the bottom x-axis from months to years. The first microwave oven came out in 1955. As shown in this picture, these ovens were wall-mounted ovens. The buyers of this innovative product were the innovators. Then, in 1967, a company named Amana introduced to the market a brand new microwave that they called radar ranges. The radar rangers were the first countertop microwave oven. Although it was more convenient, sales continued to be very slow during this time. It was not until the mid-1970s that there were significant sales in the microwave oven industry. The reason for such slow product adoption was because consumers had safety concerns and worried that if you cooked food with radiation, it would stay in the food and potentially cause cancer. It took about 20 years before the microwave oven had high adoption rates across North America. The process of market adoption was similar to the process that happened when Dr. Rogers was trying to get people to boil their water. The early adopters watched the innovators and noticed that the microwave oven wasn't causing them to get cancer. So the early adopters decided to buy a microwave oven for themselves. Then the next segment, who were the early majority, were talking to and observing the early adopters. When they noticed that the early adopters were pleased with their microwave ovens and were not getting sick, the early majority began buying microwave ovens too. By the end of the 1970s, the information about microwave ovens and the safety concerns had been addressed, and the information had diffused across Canada and the rest of North America. But that did not mean that everybody wanted a microwave oven. Many people were quite happy with their traditional oven and did not perceive a need for a new microwave. As I mentioned earlier, you can develop a target market profile for each of these diffusion of innovation segments. So what I want to do now is take a deeper look at what might be written on a target market wanted poster for each of these segments. I have placed each of the diffusion of innovation market segments onto this continuum. The ends of this continuum are anchored with either high or low, meaning that as you move from left to right on the continuum, each subsequent segment has either more or less of that trait. Okay, across the top we have our continuum categories, and in the first vertical column I will add these traits. The first trait on our list asks, how comfortable is an individual with risk? As shown here, Innovators tend to be more comfortable with risk, whereas laggards tend to be more sensitive to risks, and therefore they tend to avoid it. The early adopters are less comfortable with risk than the innovators, yet they are more comfortable with risk than those in the early majority category. And those in the early majority category are less comfortable with risk relative to the early adopters and are more comfortable with risk than the late majority. Here are two examples of how this might play out in the marketplace. Because innovators and early adopters are more comfortable with risk, they would be more likely to buy Bitcoin than the late majority or laggards. The late majority and the laggards would see buying Bitcoin as a risky venture and therefore avoid it. Here's another example. Sometimes companies offer guarantees and warranties, and sometimes they don't. Based on what you already know, what segment do you think is the least likely to be concerned with guarantees and warranties? And what segment do you think will likely be looking for these guarantees and warranties? If you guessed that the laggards will be likely looking for guarantees and warranties, you are correct. Here is the main point to remember. New product innovations are perceived to be risky, and when a consumer feels a sense of risk, they often choose to not buy the product. The next question is, how much does an individual value tradition? Someone who is very traditional in their thinking and behavior is going to be less receptive to new product innovations. Here's an example. Think about purchasing a Christmas tree. You can get a real fresh cut Christmas tree, an artificial green Christmas tree, an artificial white Christmas tree, or a pink Christmas tree. Some people will say, I only buy real Christmas trees, whereas others might say the more multicolored and outlandish the tree, the better. The main point is this. It is less risky to follow traditions because you know what to expect. In fact, innovation really is the opposite of tradition. That's why it's not a good idea to target new innovations to the late majority and the laggards. The next variable is rigidity in thinking. People who tend to be more rigid in how they think tend to see the world in simplistic or black and white terms. For example, something is either good or bad. There tends to be very little gray area. Rigidity in thinking is correlated with both one's level of education and one's level of income. People who are very rigid in their thinking also tend to have lower levels of education and higher levels of religiosity. Innovative consumers tend to be low in rigidity and more receptive to new product innovations, whereas laggards tend to be less open to alternative perspectives and views, and this is why laggards also tend to be more traditional. The next differentiating variable is based on who is the individual's reference group. With exception to the innovators, every segment tends to use the segment to their immediate left as a reference group. That is because those who are immediately to the left on the continuum are more similar in character than, say, those who are farther down the continuum. The innovators tend to be self-oriented individuals. This means that they tend not to defer to the opinions of others. They may collect information from others, however, they make their own decisions based on what they think is the right choice. In contrast, those from the right side of the continuum are more likely to follow the opinions of others. They are also more likely to be persuaded by messages from authority figures. The next two variables are related. These variables include the need for stimulation and the need for variety. Those who have a need for stimulation are more likely to drink higher amounts of coffee and engage in intellectual activities such as reading books and watching documentaries. They are also more likely to take trips to foreign destinations, whereas those who have a low need for stimulation tend to enjoy routine and the comfort associated with sticking close to home. The main implication for marketers is that innovators and early adopters are the ones who have a high need for stimulation and novelty, and therefore are often looking for new product innovations, whereas the late majority and the laggards tend to avoid purchasing new product innovations. Let's summarize the key points. The goal of the marketer is to gain product acceptance by the largest number of consumers in the shortest span of time. This is especially important when a product has a short product life cycle. The consumers in the 5 different market segments identified in the Diffusion of Innovations model have different needs, and therefore they adopt products at different rates. New product innovations will be adopted faster when the innovators and the early adopters are targeted. And finally, we also need to be conscious of the size of these different groups. The innovators make up only 2.5% of the market. While they may be a desirable segment, the absolute size of this market segment may be too small to generate a satisfactory level of sales. Therefore, when new product innovations are brought to market, it may be wise to target the early adopters and then the early majority shortly after that.